Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, New Evangelization with the Game-Changing Generation, presented by Dennis Mahaney. I'm Emily Smith, Pulse Evangelization Ministries, and I'm welcoming you to this webinar. I'm going to hand it over to Dennis.
Well, thank you, Emily. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me. Today, we're going to look at this game-changing generation, what that means for us, for the church, for what we can do together. I think in the description you saw that it stated we've heard all the disastrous church attendance reports, but even in this breakdown that we hear about, there's signs already of breakthrough. As the ranks of young unchurched grow, there's also great new opportunities to reimagine our sense of mission and our response. In such a time of this new evangelization, we need to consider it also, and consider it more broadly and deeply than perhaps has been presented so far. It's not just new in method, expression, ardor, it's also new in focus and personnel and place and process and practice. So we'll think about these things together as we think about our answers to who are these Millennials, Mosaics, the Y generation. Some even call them the iGeneration. That's most accurately used for the generation following, perhaps. But we all have labels for them. These people that are the least likely to be at church and the ones from whom we feel most estranged. So we have to consider, if we really are people of faith, we have to really consider what does our hope in Christ Jesus offer them, especially during this Advent season. What does it take to step back from the oftentimes failed and frustrated programs, and so we can perhaps imagine new opportunities, new approaches. So what I'm hoping you will see in these questions that I'm hoping to provoke in you is renewing senses of direction that will give us a sense of hope in this Advent season. And right after Christmas, we're going to return to this and talk about the more specifics that come out of this. So I today just really look forward to provoking good questions. What I'm going to suggest is a radical approach. Radical means new, but not really new, because the word radical means get back to the core, back to the root, back to our sense of original purpose. It's going to be at the level of, I most think in terms of parish. So parish culture, parish mission, parish paradigms, policies, and it has implications for program strategies and things, and we'll talk again more about that at the second part. The conclusion, though, is that essentially I would hearken and echo the words and the title, actually, of Al Winsman's book, Growing and Engaging Church, and the subtext is, Stop Doing Church and Start Being Church Again. So with that, why don't we offer up this time that we have, which is a blessing, and it's a moment of Sabbath in our lives and in this Advent that we've taken out, and let's dedicate this to God in prayer. Merciful, gracious God, it is because we are an Advent people that we discipline our hearts in this season. We wait, we expect, and we hope. We hope for what you have in store for us. Because we are people who are between things in what is and what is to be, it's because of that that we lift our souls up to you. We know you to be the source and summit of our lives. At all times, we seek your company, and we're grateful to do your will. So we seek your direction for us in this that we do in your name today, in our places. We ask you, perfect in us your hope for all, so that we might be instruments of your great promise for all people. So bless the thoughts and words of this gathering, we pray in Jesus our Lord. Amen. I'll say amen for you. So since you're all muted. So let's start with us. I'm going to make an immediate admission. I am not an early or emerging adult. Not at all, as you can tell by the picture, and I had a particularly bad hair day that day. I have, however, served as a director for young adult ministry in a parish and for a diocese. I have been one time vice president for NCYAMA, National Catholic Young Adult Ministry Association, and served as part of an advisory group that was consulted in writing Sons and Daughters of the Light, which is the USCCB statement about young adult ministry some years ago. I have a little bit of design writing in that capacity, as well as in some resources that were published in the 90s, that long ago, 90s and early 2000s from Center for Ministry Development. And my parish is loaded with young adults. Most of them, however, are immigrants. I am married, and I have 4 of my own. 4 of my children are young adults, and my last one, Elizabeth, is well on her way. She's a border carrier in that regard. She's probably an iGen person, but she is very close. And actually, all of this doesn't say anything about expertise, but it does exemplify the concern that I have, that I think a lot of people have in the church, that we have to remember we're a church of tradition, and the word tradition means pass it on. If we aren't passing on our faith, then there's something wrong. How about you? That's the question. What experiences do you have? What is your starting point? What is the perspective you have on all this? And, of course, then what biases do you bring to this? We all have them, and mine will be revealed very soon, and they invite you to consider yours. So how about this? I'll admit to some of my, in these preliminaries, couple slides, I'll admit to my biases. First, in terms of methodology, many in church circles see this young generation as a problem. Okay, why? Because they're not around, and that bugs us. In one sense, however, they do highlight some problems, though they are not the problem. The problem may be one of attendance for us, but it is one of relevance for them. In other words, whose need is driving this? We'll speak about Jesus and his approach to evangelization, and a new evangelization for his time. We have to start with a recognition that the problem may not be the problem, but the way that we see the problem may be the problem. So we have to start by, in terms of method, look at the problem not just from the inside out, but from the outside in. And in fact, that way of looking at oneself, self-awareness, is essential today because we are in a postmodern era, and it is even much more important what others say about us as an institution than it is what we say about ourselves. And there's plenty of studies that indicate that peer review is one of those qualifications and characteristics of being a postmodern, if not an emerging adult. So what is the problem? Well, from our perspective, might be how to connect, welcome, and engage emerging adults. This, however, is a trick question, and I underlined the trick part. How? How betrays part of the limitation of our perspective that might undo our efforts down the line. And this was brilliantly described by Simon Sinek, who did a TED Talk, and in that he speaks of the golden circle for persuasion and innovation, and in that he highlights some very successful companies and also points to the flaw in other organizations. He, of course, lifts up Apple because Apple does not fall for the trap that most organizations do. Most of us focus on things like, well, what are we doing? Now, what is certainly an important question to answer, but it's not the first question to answer. And in our task today, I would suggest it's the same. It's not the first question to answer. It's not about what are we going to do about reaching out to young adults, getting young adults to participate with us. It's also the question that follows a more important question, and that is how, because knowing what we do is pretty obvious for whether it's for Apple or any other company, and they know what they do. Of course, where the competition gets tough for most organizations is how, because some try to win the competition by doing it somehow better, cheaper, Walmart it, if you will, or do it in some way, in a better way than another company. And that's, I just bought a new car, and how they make the car was very important. The how became an important question. Those are not the central starting point, however. The real starting point is why. And Simon Sinek points out other companies have tried to do what Apple's done, and they failed miserably, and that's because nobody buys what you do. They buy why you do it. You have to know your why and lead with that. You have to know what it is, what motivates you, what gets your heart on fire, and that will ignite hearts in other people. And that is the sweet spot in our brains for persuasion and innovation. We all know of the neurocortex at the top, which is the what part of our brain. We can think about all the details and all the best ways to do everything, so that's the what and the how. But below that is the limbic system, the reptilian brain, and even before that is a core of our consciousness, and that responds to why, the motivation, where it's an emotional link and it's an emotional draw. So for us, this all is based on who. It is Jesus who is Lord in our lives. So we have to have first a burning relationship with a living God. And we have to recognize that God at the center of our lives. Otherwise, all those other questions are rather mundane. So the sweet spot is to know who, and we're going to start with that question as it pertains to emerging adults to start, because this is where we, even babies, in fact, recognize faces. There's something very, very basic in the brain that reacts to people first before any of the other questions. So we're going to basically follow this path back out. And if you want to see a great little video that Simon Sinek does that explains this in more depth with more illustrations, the link is there on the slide. Second is terminology. I have to admit, I don't like, even though I've been a director of young adult everything, I don't like the term young adult. I think it's the wrong place to start because it's a contronym. And if we consider who young people are at the age of, say, early 20s, or who come out and are starting life already with at least sometimes over $100,000 in school debt, that they very often can go to war, and we are fighting real ones right now. You can go to war now if you're a male or a female, in fact, and that within 5 years, these young people are sometimes very easily earning more than their parents did within 5 years. So I think perhaps another term would be better. So I would suggest and prefer we go with something like emerging adults. Now, the one good thing about young adult is that it kind of is, it's because it's a contronym, it speaks about arrived and not yet and complete, incomplete. It kind of admits, it kind of gives recognition to our own paradoxical position with regard to this population. So we acknowledge our ignorance and the mystery of encountering people that are different from us, with whom we, in some ways, have lost touch as a church. It engenders humility. There's a legitimate starting point there for new evangelization. It was the stance of Jesus in Judea, Paul with the Gentiles, Francis Xavier in Asia, and Gandhi in South Africa. It encourages us to first earn the right to be heard, and that always starts with listening. So it's good to have a humble stance as we start this. But how about emerging adults? Well, emerging adults are adults first. Most of these young adults, if you want to use that term, are not looking for a group, which is what many young adult ministries and parishes have either started as or devolved into, which often really becomes a singles ministry. And I'm not saying that emerging adults don't welcome community and support. They certainly, most certainly do. but they do not want to be lavished with greetings and treated like royalty and then quickly considered like an alien oddity perhaps, and then quickly forgotten and allowed to drift off into cyberspace of our churches. Everybody wants to develop a community with friendships, encounter God, have opportunities to use their God-given gifts, and grow in relationships. And essentially, we need no program to do that. We need no only intentional relationships to satisfy them. Here's a word about resources. So these are the resources that I probably have stolen from most liberally and that I would propose to you for your avid interest. I'll make reference to some of these. Some of them are like the Pew Research bulletins come out all the time, so you can be kept up to date. Barna sends out something quite similar on a regular basis that highlights their research. So there are great resources out there. There was a time, not too long ago in my life, when you had to really dig to find anything that would give you good information, good facts, good statistics. So let's start with the first question. So who are these emerging adults? They're called Millennials, Mosaics, iGeneration. Are they more different or similar to us? So that's my question for you, and I want an answer. What do you think? What's your first impression of these people? What do you think defines their world that did not perhaps impact ours as we grew up to be your age, their age rather? So here are the questions, and I'm looking for some feedback. I trust you're out there, and now I'd like you to tell me, who do you think they are? Let's see if we can fill this poll and get a sense of our own experience. Are they diverse? Are they subjectivists? Are they secularists? Technocrats? Alienated, socially alienated, hyper-connected, global people? Are they optimists, realists? Self-interested, self-absorbed even, distrustful? Are they experimental, digital natives, self-confident? Are they rootless, or are they tolerant? What most defines who they are? As you can see, the bars are changing as we place our votes.
And you can pick more than one if you'd like to.
Okay, this looks like a good sampling. So we see that who's winning out right now is our sense of their digital passport. That citizenship is a big definer of who they are, and along with that is their sense of great tolerance. That's a marked quality for this generation. That they are diverse and tolerant, and that global citizens, and the other things kind of fall out in turn. And of course, I didn't give you any wrong answers. These are all right answers. So let's take them one piece at a time and see how much truth and what is beneficial to know, what's the most productive, constructive information we can ascertain about them. So, new evangelization with this game-changing generation, is it that people think that they're a gadget-laden group of urban sophisticates? Well, perhaps. They certainly are more diverse than most generations. They certainly are more comfortable with technology and change. They certainly do, if they live around an urban center, a city like Buffalo, where I'm at right now, they do find city centers desirable because of economics and being able to find community and several other things all within a good space. Unprecedented in their sense of autonomy, a decidedly, therefore, experimental and self-confident approach to living, because, of course, technology puts them in charge. Hungry for meaning and community, which is a kind of a balancing side of the coin. And their sense of globalized worldview also gives them a sense of great tolerance for diversity. They're less tribal. They're probably the least tribal generation that the species, our species, has ever known. So they can feel more uncertain about their purpose in life. They can see digital life and real life rather seamlessly. They can place more priority and do on education for a lot of economic reasons. They are preoccupied with their identity exploration, which is a developmental task, which might distinguish them and better distinguish them. Hopefully older people have a better sense of all the pieces that go into personal identity, whether it's sex roles or vocation in life, lifestyle choices, partnering. There's all kinds of things that are identified and solidified at this stage of life, all deeply spiritual questions too. They exercise unprecedented freedom and control due to technology. They possess a tempered optimism, though they're skeptical about the economy. Prosperity is within grasp, though it may take multiple career changes and retooling. They can be patient, therefore, with ordering several key life tasks in their life. Career will be first. Education will support that. Marriage may follow, and then perhaps children. They are risk-averse, though sexually permissive, considerate of individuals as autonomous agents, reluctant to commit in relationships or civic participations. And church is, again, one of those, as from their point of view, trusting in an internal locus of authority, and also, of course, concurrently distrustful of any absolute claims to truth. They rely upon scientific sources to obtain truth. Now, all these qualities, all these characteristics, I'm not giving them to you because this is my experience with my kids. These are what I'm gleaning from the Barna and Pew research, among other sources, CARA. There are several great organizations out there. Christian Smith, of course, wrote a series of wonderful books on this generation and their religious practices with a variety of other authors. And so whether it's Souls in Transition, Soul Searching, or the most recent Young Catholic America, there's all kinds of great studies. And in fact, Christian Smith uses that term. He's convinced that emerging adults in, out of, and gone from the church. It's about emerging adults and what our relationship is with them. So they are middle-class dreamers still. They think they can finish school, get a good job, have children, be financially secure, drive a good car, have the vacation, all the fun, and all the expectations of their economy. And therefore, they're consumers. And they're born into global consumerism, that they see that shopping is fun, that it's all good, no quantity is too much. Using objects to define life goals is something that our culture has placed before them, and they use it. They avail themselves to whatever objects can help them define life. They're somewhat tone deaf to a critique of materialism, though helping others is still valuable. It's a personal choice. So they are realists who know that they have their hands full just getting on their own 2 feet. So they are rather self-absorbed in that way. They are living through an unprecedented period of discontinuous change, social, cultural, economic, technological, spirituality, and they live in a society that today, not just for emerging adults, is defined by increasing pace, complexity, fluidity, diversity, and uncertainty. Now, they remain captivated by Jesus Christ, but they are less impressed with his disciples, and that's us. They distrust institutions, have unprecedented access to unmediated information. They don't have to go to authority figures or institutions. they derive wisdom from various self-organized circles. They question authority that's outside and as a result have less contact points with institutions and communities, so they feel a certain amount of extra social alienation. So diverse and complex they are, which only matches the landscape, because that's what's happened in the landscape. Barna uses the descriptor mosaic to describe not just the discontinuity of their lives, but the discontinuity of our times, that the two are mirror images and they are in relationships. They're in a tension and a flux. They are organically connected. So if you want to know why a young American does X, it's probably because American culture says X. If they want to do Y, it's because there are cues in culture that are directing them towards Y, etc. So utilitarian patchwork, younger Christians are open to fundamental questions of meaning, spirituality, morality. And here's the but. People tend to be most religious and religiously active when they're settled. So here's the one, perhaps, strand of hope for some people. Transitions cause stress, and that causes distraction and drains our psychic resources. And chronic inconsistency will lessen the importance of religious practice. We found that to be the case with people who are in transitional situations, whether they're relocating, whether they're refugees, whether they're in life change situations because of things happening in their family. As a result, emerging adults are the least settled as a generation, and therefore they will seem the least religious. And emerging adults can best be reached, even though they seem disconnected. They can be reached, and best by going to the issues that are close to home for them. Purpose in life is, of course, a central life question for them. And because of the inconsistency of society, they have deep hungers for meaning and purpose that go along with their questions about family and kinship and partnership and who are they going to spend their life with and how they're going to make a life, where are they going to live and how are they going to make that living. So all those are deeply places for meaningful conversation about purpose in life. So okay, first stop is who, and we've talked about who. So now I have some wonders and worries about you. What are you wondering? What are your questions about who we are discussing? Or comments before we dig into what that says about the why question and what we do with them and what we do about ourselves in relationship to them. So I invite you to use that chat option. There's some questions you have about the people we're discussing.
So I've got one right now, actually, that came in a little bit earlier, and that was asking, what specific age range are we talking about when we talk about emerging adults?
Well, it's going to depend which researcher you go with, but I would say typically we're talking 18 to 25. Some cut it 22 to 27, but we're talking 20 and around the age of 20, and how that goes proceeds from there. So if most parishes organize around youth ministry for middle and high school age, and then say they let go of people because they presume they're going off to college, and then that's campus ministry land, it's really either at that point, at that age, if they're not in campus ministry, or as soon as they get back, that we ask them a lot of questions. We meaning organizations like CARA and Pew and Barna, ask them a lot of questions about who they are, where they're headed. So I would say right in the heart would be like someone 22, 24 years old.
Okay, and then one person asked, what are you referencing when you reference self-organizing circles?
Okay, so self-organizing circles for me, because I actually have a Google Plus account, is we literally have circles. And of course, then some of the other social medias tried to pick that up. I think Twitter, and to lesser extent, perhaps Facebook. But some of them now allow you to create multiple circles that you organize yourself. And before social media, of course, got hold of this, it was because they were studying, at the time it was Gen Xers, and they realized and found out that Gen Xers were creating their own wisdom circles. And their wisdom circle would change based on the area of life that they needed to draw that inspiration. So they would have certain people of certain generations in one wisdom circle, but when it came to other things like where to go out tonight and where to go to the best school or where to get a job, they would shift their circle. And so these all become self-organizing, and this practice has become now ubiquitous. It's not just younger people. We all self-organize and create new circles. It used to be that when I was a kid, the parish was the center of life in the community, and you did everything there. We have churches here that have bowling alleys in their basements and bars and everything you can imagine because there was only one circle. You were a member of this circle or you were out. And right now, people have many circles. I've got my Google Plus has like 8 or 9 circles, and depending on who you are and what connections I have with you, you're in a different circle.
I don't have any other questions or comments right now, but again, people can send them in as we go along. I know we've got another point later on for people to chime in.
Okay, so proceed on why. So what does all this say to us about what we're doing, why we're doing it? So let's talk about this notion of game changer. Like, why did I say they're a game changer generation? Is it really? Like we said that about Gen Xers. As a matter of fact, I have to admit, before the generation before them, why is this sense of change so big? Well, Pope Francis recently said this. We're not living in an era of change. We are in a change of era. So what he's trying to suggest is it is absolutely fundamental, foundational, essential that we're about change in everything. It's affecting everything, and we are not. The church is not exempt from that, immune from the effects of that. Now, what is that? Why is that important? Well, this most recent generation has become the most adaptive, innovative generation, and as a result of being virtuoso in this, they can keep us in the game. So if all these statistics are true about dire, dread about what's happening with church attendance, well, the answers and how to do that might very well be found in conversation with this generation. According to Ryan Jenkins of Yahoo Small Business, he suggests that we are justified to call these folks the game changers because they're the largest generation on our planet. And because they're the largest, they are going to develop larger influence. The greater the size, the greater the influence. And that's going to be in everything, economic, social, culture, political. They're talking about it already, especially with what's going on in the Republican Party. But it's also spiritual. It's also religious. So they are, if you will, they are virtuoso. They're masters at learning to adapt. And we are a church that desperately needs to, as Pope Francis would say, learn to become more adaptive. So they are also significant because they will outspend boomers, who have been the real cash cows. They'll outspend us by 2018. That they are the most educated generation in the history of our species. They take the lead from those around them. They are very educated. They need look nowhere else. And as a majority of U.S. executives will soon retire, this one generation will leapfrog into quick prominence and influence in our culture. At the same time, emerging adults are postmoderns just like us. And according to Dr. Butler Bass, who's written a few books about this, about church after, or Christianity after church and things like that, church leaders and other people that are advising us at the levels of councils, whether it's finance or pastoral councils, are probably accepting premises that are no longer in force. And one of those premises is that believing leads to behaving, which leads to belonging. Boomers are coming out of a cultural Catholicism that provided many things foundationally all around us before we got to the doors of church. And in fact, families bring people to church. It's not the other way around. It's not church that forms families. It's families that bring people to church. So we have this skewed notion, if you're in my generation or above, and you read things, we read things, not necessarily as they are, but as we are. So we value believing so much that we think it's the starting point now, and it is not. It's definitely not for postmoderns. For them, it's belonging that leads to behaving, which leads to believing. That literally changes the game for us. It changes the programs, how we spend our money, what we prioritize and spend our money on, the shape of our buildings, the shape of the rooms, how we use them. Emerging adults journey from belonging to behaving to believing. And by the way, so did Jesus. He was a prophet, and yet he did not establish a synagogue. They called him a teacher, but he created no program. He established no church. Instead, he gathered a small group and formed a community, a place of belonging. Likewise, emerging adults today have little interest in creedal loyalty. They will respond to invitations to friendship. People follow their hearts and are persuaded by the who, as we saw in the beginning of all this, and then the why of it, and that's how Jesus operated. He started with the hearts of people. He responded to matters of the heart, even when religious leaders tried to draw him into the theological debates. He turned those into questions of the heart. So when tested about the law, in which commandment is the greatest, he turned it into, well, who is your neighbor? So the vertical relationship was converted to horizontal. In other words, belonging is the starting point and perhaps the foundation. They also moved from belonging to behaving before believing. Jesus demanded that we love one another. In fact, the earliest church was called the Way. And they said things like, they must be Christians. See how they love one another. The early church was ignited by the witness of people who lived differently, apostles, saints, and martyrs. They were different folks. They walked different, and they talked different. They were just different. And the Gospels were not treatises on some morality or some theology. They were stories that stirred action and commitment and hospitality and caring and justice and hope. St. Paul might have been the great intellect of the early church, but he was always boiling things down to demands of following Jesus, follow or not, fundamental behaviors. He said things like, in the end, there will be three things that will last, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. And those things all lead to believing. The belief, though, was in Jesus. Remember in the passage from Scripture, as Jesus is the way, conduct, the truth, confession, and confession, not just book knowledge, but to confess it. And then the life, which was a communion with Christ, a communion with the body of Christ, the community of faith, community of disciples. The confession of faith made by Peter and Paul, or the beloved disciple, these were all born of a friendship and a commitment to something which could not be proved. And Jesus offered no philosophy, he lived. He presented no quantity of irrefutable argument, no volumes, no summas. He invited others to love as they love themselves and be ambassadors of mercy. So the game changer is already in understanding that with emerging adults, it's not about believing, behaving, and belonging. It's belonging which leads to behaving and leads to believing. That's changing the game. Now, if all this talk about change makes you anxious, think of how Jesus' disciples must have felt. If you remember, there was a passage in Matthew chapter 14 where it's emblematic, actually, of discipleship, and it's where Jesus, after the return of the 12, the feeding of the 5,000, Herod's question, the rejection in Nazareth, he's clear about his purpose, and he sends his disciples out in the boat ahead of him to the other side while he dismisses the crowd he's been teaching and goes up to the mountain to pray. When it's evening, he's there all alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, is being tossed about by waves, for the wind was against it. In the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them. Now, you know the story. So here Jesus is coming to them, but the disciples, we need to recognize the disciples are caught in a storm. And they're caught in a storm on Lake Galilee. The Galilean Sea is 141 feet deep, at its deepest point. So this is a shallow body of water. This is like Lake Erie that I'm looking out my window right now and looking at which is similarly very shallow, 90-some feet. So just like Lake Erie, the shallow bodies of water are the most treacherous because the wind can have such a quick and immediate impact on the water. So, and any fisherman knows this, of course. Peter, they all knew this. So it's just as the waves are battering the boat that Jesus comes to them walking on water and says, and everyone doesn't even recognize him, they can't tell who it is, and they think it's a ghost, until he speaks because of how dark it is. He looked like a ghost. It was when Peter finally recognized him after he spoke, even though they were terrified. And then, right at that moment, now so you got to picture this. This is not like being on a lake or even on an ocean, anywhere near where we've ever been, because we have lights all over the shore that light up like incredible. When they were on the water, it was pitch black. It was the fourth watch, means the dead of night. There are no fires on the shores. There are no lights in the distance, no cities with glow. They were pitch black in a storm, so they must have been absolutely terrified. It was at that moment that Jesus invites them out of the boat. Can you imagine that? That's the most incredible, ridiculous demand you could ever have at the time. They can't even see where they're going, and they can't tell where the water is, except that they're floundering. So at that moment, why in the world would Jesus ask them to come out of the boat? The boat is significant because, of course, this is the Gospel of Matthew, and Matthew is the gospel of the church. And very often Matthew, in the stories, he buries something that symbolizes the church. And of course, the church is the earliest symbol one of the earliest symbols for our faith. And the bark of Peter, of course, the bark of St. Peter, symbolizes the whole church as a boat. I don't think it's any coincidence that Matthew has Jesus inviting them to leave the safety of the church as they knew it, the comfort of the church as it was. In the early church, when they were hearing this gospel, Matthew was speaking to their heart and inviting them as disciples that they would have to do something different. And so they were invited to leave. It's only after Peter is faithful in risking that Jesus saves him. It's only after that he saves them all and then causes them to exclaim who he is and refound their faith. It's an encounter that leads to new courage, that leads to a declaration. So the questions for us, of course, are the same. Am I willing to get out of the boat? What can we change about the way we do church? That while it might be comfortable for us, is of little comfort to emerging adults. And how does the church continue to expect them to meet our expectations? In other words, we sort people out rather than welcome them in. So take a moment, just as examination of conscience as a church leader. How are we at this, and how are we willing to adjust and accommodate? Or are we going to stay in the boat and expect everything to change around us? That is the question of faith for the early disciples, and that's what emerging adults are asking us. What do we want is not the question. It's what do they want from us? If we're willing to change, then we're going to pay attention to their needs first. We're going to be responsive, and Jesus was responsive. Perhaps we have little to change, but the way we offer it in the starting point might be what has to change. So, are we talking about emerging adults as a distinct species, or is it perhaps that they are really just canaries in our coal mine? Now, globalization has happened, and we are citizens, all of us, of a brave new world. Elders, however, grew up slowly to this. They had family, they had neighborhood, they had community and tribe, culture, all securing so we could get ready for this. Emerging adults were dumped into a global reality. They have distrust based on everything that's been happening since they came to the earth, in authority and institutions, and very low brand loyalty at the same time. Now, we kid about how Al Gore once said that he created the internet, but one thing's for sure, it was not an emerging adult who created the internet. These things were created before they arrived, and they have adapted to these realities. It used to be you had to go to church or a concert or somewhere organized and gathered to hear inspiring music and messages, or at least buy a CD that was recorded there. Now anyone can attend anything and be in on something before it ever comes to light. And that's the world they've come to. And likewise, when's the last time you paid anything that cost $500, either with a check or with cash? No one does that anymore. It's a digital lifestyle. And again, emerging adults did not create it, but it is their reality. They distrust the police, as we all do in a lot of ways now, after a year of evidence to distrust. They distrust and there are people of all ages in organizations like the Tea Party, and distrust authority regularly unless authority in some way earns respect. So suspicion is a starting point, and change. So 4 of top 5 global corporations didn't even exist 40 years ago. So we need to engender trust and not just presume because we're old, we've been here, that we are trustworthy. That's not going to go anywhere with emerging adults. They have a hunger for purpose and mission, but they won't stay at cause as long if they don't produce fruit. And they believe that they can change the world. And we now have icons of that power in Xers like Gates and now Zuckerberg and Chan, who literally have shown that you can have everything and be a superhero all in one lifetime. Whether it's charity runs, the next generation has all kinds of ways to change the world and have global impact. And we should be partnering with them if we want to respond to their faith needs. They have a hunger for purpose, and they're working to live, not living to work, as some older generations. And they have a eclectic spirituality. They have unique ways that start with them to find meaning. Now, that doesn't negate that we have more in common, by far, with the God who created us and loved us. But Christians have to begin to imagine themselves somewhere along the road with the emerging adults. We have to get on the same road with them and consider the what and how the game perhaps is changed, and recognize that they are now full players and they can now be game changers. Jesus was all about what? He offered an abundant life to all people. And disciples encounter abundance with Jesus. We follow Jesus because of that abundance. We find joy in Jesus, and we want to share that with other people. This is the heart of intentional discipleship. So the path is from personal faith to shared faith, typically, and they have a distinct faith experience, and they are on the same road, and we need to recognize it. They experience God. They examine their experiences with God. They encounter God in personal ways, and they express their faith. Now, intentional discipleship might look like this. This might look very complicated, but perhaps it shows where we can meet emerging adults and one another along this road. It's a path of encountering, following, enjoying, and sharing Christ. Now, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see this is the story of Emmaus, that they were along the road. They were on a path, and they were on a path of discipleship. And it was a personal faith that they were living that had somehow been ignited by their experience with Christ. This is a similar reality to all of us. We start with a faith, and everything on the inside of the circle is internal to what happens to us. Everything on the outside are the kinds of things that happen external. They don't have to happen in this order, but these are the kinds of things that are still happening in the lives of emerging adults. They start with a faith that's adopted. They get it from somebody else, parent, friend, colleague, teacher. They search their faith. They test it. They assent to things in faith, and then they own that faith. And what happens on the outside is commensurate and causes this. Someone introduces them to Jesus, witnesses to faith. They participate with others in a congregation. They hear the gospel with open ears. They encounter Christ in concrete ways, pray and learn to pray, and deepen their prayer life. They have formal preparation, and they have intentional participation in some small group, usually experiences. They seek out spiritual direction and begin to discern ministry possibilities, and they serve. All of this leads to an outpouring of energy, the heart burning within them, just like the disciples along the road. Certain things happen inside and outside, but it continues. This energy that builds up in us, it causes the spiritual energy, has to, in some way, be let out. So the only question is how. And if the person expresses it, then what happens inside them further is greater acceptance of grace and commitment to a life of community and discipleship. They enjoy and are new satisfaction with the life that is united with Christ. They have spiritual pressure growing in them to share this. They have interest in others and a missionary desire because they hear more and share more faith witnessing that includes expression of doubt and struggle and outreach to other people, and they start sharing their story and growing in the sharing of their story. They grow with Christ by sharing their faith in Christ. There's an explosion at some point in our lives, little ones, big ones, and we eventually want to sponsor others in faith. What moves us along the path is conversion. Little moments in our lives, we have God moments, we have moments of crisis, of struggle, of success. We grow in faith when we share it, and parishes are about discipling people. So every parish should be able to do this. The conversions come from all kinds of things and affect our life and our faith in all kinds of ways. But God is gone from being seen as a distant force to a close, caring person. The church from speaking about an it to speaking about us, from knowing about Jesus to knowing Jesus, from self-rule to self-surrender, from life as a series of events and problems to a journey with meaning and purpose, even when there are moments that are filled with suffering. The truth is, it goes from acceptance to appreciation and full assent of complete person to truth that is life-defining and transforming, and that mission becomes important. And it's not about self-satisfaction or salvation. It is now about compassion and moving outward in greater circles to others. That's what Pope Francis, of course, is inviting us to in this year of mercy. So this is a path that works with what's happening inside of us and moves us to outside. If something goes wrong, of course, which it does in some people, if we don't find a constructive outlet for the spiritual pressure, I would point out on the right circle, personal faith, that person on the inside, and the warning that this faith, left unexpressed, unexercised, can cause indifference, doctrinal rigidity, lethargy, relativism, excessive or mechanistic piety, and intolerance to frailties in ourselves or others. This is the path, and where we are on the path with emerging adults, I think, is a critical question. They live profoundly spiritual lives. They explore all the essentials of life: vocation, intimacy, life direction, lifestyle, establishing households, setting expectations for personal conduct and life purpose. Jesus was always about reaching out to people where they were at. He was on the high roads and the by roads. He never sat in a synagogue or a temple and expected people to come to him. He walked along the road. He listened. He earned the right to be heard. And his friends experienced God, examined their experience with him, encountered God in him, ignited their faith, and they were sent out. So those same 4 steps, that we experience Christ, we follow Christ, we find joy in Christ, and we share Christ. Today, discipleship is about introducing others to Christ along the road. It happens peer-to-peer and in small groups. It doesn't happen in programs anymore. So, as we start to conclude, where are you along the road? That's the question. Do you know where you are along this road? What is your strategy when you come across emerging adults? They come into our churches. They're around. They're with families. They're at sacraments. They're around and all over. What are we doing about it? How are we encountering them? And there's no model that has all the answers. Did you see a limitation, perhaps, to this model that doesn't speak to your experience with emerging adults? take note of that, then it needs to be modified. Comments or questions at this point?
We have a couple have come in. So let me check real quick. So how do you find that we, I guess because I think I'm technically an emerging adult, respond to the term emerging adult? That is, do they see themselves this way?
Do they see themselves that way as opposed to the other names?
As opposed to young adult, etc., millennial, whatever term gets thrown around regularly for us.
Yeah, and you name it. The person will use any one of the lexicon that's out there. Our lexicon, as I think Christian Smith argued pretty well, is based on who they are, where they're going, what they need, what they want out of life, and their status, their position. They're far more than anachronistic beings that we can't understand, which I think is what young adult kind of suggests. And so as long as we know how we're, let people define themselves. Let people, always self-define. And, in Christian Smith's work, of course, he interviewed thousands of, young adults, Gen Y people, whatever other label we want to use. So that was his wisdom on it, and I think there are benefits to it. There's no perfect label because they're all labels.
Okay, and then a somewhat similar question, or in a similar vein, how do we better let them know that they are welcomed and invited?
We're going to speak specifically to that in the next one, and several examples, because I think we have to come back to now the question that we started with: how do we connect, welcome, and engage emerging adults? And of course, one of the things that we need to do is not do it to anyone. We need to empower. In fact, that's where we're going now. But we need to empower, and you'll see this in the next slides. We need to empower young adults to name their spiritual hungers and to address them with one another. Maybe that looks like an incubator approach to ministry, but most of these young adults or emerging adults that are responding to these don't want anything programmed on them. They want to be invited to friendships and be connected to mission. So transforming mission and doing things that count. I would just quickly say there was one defining experience I had when I was on a Habitat project with a bunch of these were college-age students, and I do a couple of programs, Young Neighbors in Action during the summer and various things. So we're slamming hammers, talking about life, and of course it's all coming to spiritual hungers. And at some point, one of my partners there said, "Well, have you ever thought of coming to church with us? Because these are really important things, and you really got your handle on a lot of this. Why don't you come to church? We go to church. This is Saturday. We go to church on Sundays. Why don't you come to church? We all hang out afterwards. We go eat." And the answer was amazing, because when they asked this young man, "Why don't you come to church with us?" his response was, "I am." Because of course, that is being church. Being in mission, being ambassadors of mercy, which of course is what Pope Francis calls us to, is being church. Another answer to that comes from Jamie Manson, who recently spoke at that NCR conference about emerging adults. She's one herself, and she says you can't take anything for granted, not even what you think is uncontestable sacramentality. There are no sacred cows who will go untipped. And she quotes Keenan Osborne, who said, "If we don't accompany people at the table at the table of the world, we can't expect them to accompany us at the table of the Eucharist, and because they won't be able to." And the young person once said it differently to me: "I'll never believe Jesus is on the altar if I don't see Jesus around the altar. If we are not the body of Christ, if we're not in mission, we can't do that." So Jamie Mason invites them to invent their own religion in classes that she teaches, and one of the things she discovers is they build in many great things into their religion. Almost never a clergy, almost never the kind of trappings that we in professional ministry, like myself, spend most of our time on, but what is central is small communities that focus on real-life issues, intimacy, presence, and mission. So those might be some of the ways that we can do that. The brilliance of her strategy, though, is that she started with the question and let them identify their faith hunger and let them identify their stance towards spirituality. Now, there's all kinds of ways that they're learning to stand on their own, and that's why they do things in a very subjective way, which is on these slides. I'll let you, go through these. But what I'd suggest to you maybe is at the heart of all this, and this will be our last thought before we set up our next meeting, is there is a spiritual tension in this brave new world that they did not create, but we were part of creating, that we're all in some way in a relationship with God. And for some of us, God is of little importance, very small, like on the left. And for others of us, God is very important, like on the right, bigger, central to my life. And we all participate in the church in one way or the other. Some of us, very little, church is small in our life, and others, the church is big in our life. So this is the vertical and horizontal relationship that Jesus was always speaking to and battling the religious leaders of his time. Some people would like to think that if you want to find one, you go to the other. But today, in this world, those are not the same. In fact, they're almost juxtaposed. You now have completely distinct populations of people, and these were the same groups that existed in Jesus' day, and that's why we need the responsive model of evangelization to respond to these people. Now, this sense of the world, if everyone is in the world, in our world, could be plotted on a graph that you would make with these X and Y axis, the horizontal relationship and the vertical. This was all spelled out by Albert Winseman in the book Growing an Engaged Church in 2006, and it was brought to real life and focus in the analysis that John Roberto uses for dealing with faith formation and the attention or the interest that young people especially have in organized religion. But I suggest it's more basic than that. It's the vertical and horizontal relationship of me and God and me and neighbor. Now, there are some people like us, the ones in this conference, that are engaged in the church, high attention to God and high participation in church. But there also are people for whom either God doesn't play a big part right now, or the church doesn't play a big part. Some people show up at church, but they're just involved. It's not transforming their life. And other people are seeking God desperately in their life, profoundly in their life, but they don't see us as a resource. There are also some people that are just too busy, and some are cave dwellers. Winseman calls them cave dwellers consistently against virtually everything. They're so self-absorbed, there's nothing else outside of them that's important. Now, the Go Make Disciples, the bishops pointed out quite some time ago that we have a solution for that, because the goals of evangelization speak to these populations. For the involved, we need to foster enthusiasm for their faith that causes them to give witness to their life. The seekers, we need to partner with them to transform the world through the power of the gospel. And for the engaged, we need to enable them and empower them to invite others to know Jesus. This is what should happen and what we're going to speak to in the next session. What we need to do is mobilize the engaged to reach out, because the others are our neighbors and our nephews and our cousins and our colleagues at work, and they are spiritual seekers and involved people. We need to welcome and engage them, and once we do that, then those are the people who can ultimately reach out and connect to those who are furthest away from us. So the strategies that we're going to speak about in the next session will be about this relationship. Now, the twist that Pew Research is now advising us is they're not only people who are none of no affiliation, there are people who have had enough of us, and they're done, they're finished. So there are some challenges we have to talk about in that next session. So this new evangelization isn't just new in method and ardor. We need to talk about, of course, the ardor of having handmade disciples and context that's off campus and expression that isn't about certitude but is about listening, and personnel that is everyone, not professional holy people, priests, nuns. And the method is about relationships, and that it's about life lessons that come out of people's lives. So we'll come to these examples. I can mention those later again. But if we're going to get to people about this, we have plenty of opportunities, and we'll talk about those. But that is the task. How do we connect, welcome, and engage emerging adults? And we'll speak to that next month. So, Emily, I'll give it to you from here.
Okay, I had one or two more comments come in, or questions.
Sure.
The first one is, how does this model change the way parishes live? I.e., how does looking at programs versus communities and focusing more on the communities, how does that change the way a parish functions?
Well, it was probably asked before I put those last couple slides up.
Yeah.
Because it means we need to go off campus. It needs to be we have to reprioritize everything, including funding. We're using small groups. There are churches that totally redefine their community through and reorganize their parish life through small groups. So some parishes have gone quite radical. Some churches, like the one in Rebuilt, that's a popular book. That's one of the strategies they used, was to rebuild their community around small groups. Now that parish, of course, lost a significant number of people before it gained traction, but now it's consistently larger. But it's really about relationships. It's really about focusing on, let's see if I can go back to this, I can point this out again. So it's ardor, it's about discipleship, not about programs and not about denominational affiliation. So we have to get back to Jesus, all about Jesus, just like Pope Francis is saying. It's really not about anything other than Jesus, and that leads us to everything else, all other truth, all other life. And it's off campus, and it's about asking questions and engaging people in conversations. And I can talk about, there are some concrete examples. We can go more into that in another session. Anything else?
Okay. I think that was the majority of the questions. I'm going to add one thing as a actual emerging adult that I've heard from other emerging adults that I know you touched on, but I wanted to kind of reinforce here. I was in a group called Apostles on Mission. That was basically a bunch of young adults in the Archdiocese of Washington. There were about 20 of us. We all came together each week to learn about evangelization and mission. And at the end of it, we went out and formed our own communities, either in our parish or some form of men's group that took on several parishes wide. And we kept running into the same problems where parishes are very set in their ways. Yeah. And, you'd have a young adult come in and say, hi, I'd like to start this new group. And they would immediately be like, well, sorry, someone else is already meeting in that room that night. Okay, how about another night? No, that one doesn't work. So there's often the feeling that even when the young adults who do want to try and, emerging adults, when we do come to a parish, we're sometimes met with, sorry, that's not the way we do it. So just reinforcing that as a way of thinking that we are out there, and we do want to. There are many of us who do want to be involved, but sometimes even our own parishes we're met with not welcoming, and so that can be really hard to overcome when you try and are discouraged.
Certainly is, and of course it begs the question in all new evangelization, whether you use a Catholics Come Home kind of a media campaign, blitz, whatever it is, do we really want them? We got to start by answering that question. It's who? Do we really want them to be part, and do we want to shift and make the change and get out of the boat that's the church the way we like it, that goes the way we want, where we have our night for our activity and not have to share. So this slide, I think that's up now suggests where we're going in that next session, and it's really more about concrete ways to consider the tremendous promise and opportunities that are available. And it's going to be about connecting, welcoming, and engaging with emerging adults.
Okay. And,
thank you, everyone.
A couple questions to stick with you as we end today's webinar. And on this last slide here, we do have the registration for the upcoming webinar, so part 2. If you'd like to join us for that, that would be great. And so I'd like to thank Dennis again for joining us, and thank you as well for joining us. It's been an interesting discussion, and I look forward to seeing everyone next month in the new year.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, everyone. Bye. Dennis, you still there?